This story from the Gospel of Luke is in the context of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. Just prior to this, he's told us that he's on his way with his disciples. And in this particular reading, he is spending time in those who are considered to be no good, rotten scoundrels, the sinners, and the Pharisees, those upright, upstanding citizens of the religious order, question Jesus. Doesn't he know that these people he's hanging out with are no good outcasts? And at this, Jesus tells the story about this family, a father and their two sons. And I'd like to share with you today some perspectives from Reverend Kenneth Bailey, who lived for many, many years. He's a biblical scholar who lived for many years in the Middle East and has a little bit different perspective in that he sees the Palestinian context and the Middle Eastern cultural background of these stories. He's written up this particular story in a book called The Cross and the Prodigal. And I hope his thoughts help add to our understanding of the reason why this story means so much to so many of us. The first thing right off the bat is that this younger son requests his inheritance while his father is still alive. Now, to our ears, that might not seem all that unusual, but in that culture, it was like a slap in the face to the father, and as good as saying, "Drop dead, Dad, because I want my money now." That's how the audience in Jesus' day would have heard that. It was horribly shameful for a child to ask for their inheritance while their parent is still alive. So right off the bat, Jesus has kind of put everyone off balance and is calling to mind a situation that is virtually impossible to fathom how a child could act that way toward his parent. The father is supposed to get angry and perhaps insult him. The one example of this that Kenneth Bailey could find in other literature was a time when this happened, and the father was so incensed that he slapped his son across the face with the back of his hand, which is even more insulting in that Palestinian culture, and immediately cast him out. The second thing is we imagine that maybe the older son, being wiser, might begin to do their best to mend this rift between the father and the younger son, assuming that the younger son must have somehow lost their mind to make such a shameful request. And so one would expect the older son to begin doing what work they could to repair that relationship, but there's no word of that in this story that Jesus tells. There was a tradition in Jewish rural culture at that point that if the father of the household was not under any pressure, they could in fact issue an oral will that would separate or divide the inheritance among their heirs. But it was understood that the wealth, the property would still remain in the parent's own control, and the parent would profit from the property until they died. And so again, this request to divide the inheritance while the father is still alive is totally unheard of. The next thing we notice is that the son immediately cashes in their inheritance. As soon as the father turns it over to them, the son cashes it in. The reference in the text is that he turned the property into cash. And again, no one in their right mind would do this because for generations, families would pass on their land to the succeeding generation. And the idea was not only was this retirement income for the parents, it was also the inheritance for the children and succeeding generations as well. So again, in multiple ways, it seems that the young man is rejecting tradition and is rejecting the love of his father, embodied in this willingness to give so freely of that which belongs to them. We hear from the text that the young son cashes in his inheritance and travels off to the far country. I'm sure all of us can kind of imagine what it's like when you finally break free from home and you get to experience life on your own for the first time. And in this particular case, the text says that he ended up wasting his inheritance on expensive living. It doesn't say necessarily immoral living. That's a perspective that the older brother brings into the story later on. But, living the good life, living high on the hog, as we might say, even though that's not kosher for Jews, that he was indeed living it up, enjoying everything that life at home back down on the farm did not afford him. But as we all know, soon enough, all of his inheritance was expended. What's worse is that there was a famine on the land, and now he had no way of earning a living or getting anything to eat. And so eventually he hired himself out to a local farmer who, of all things, was raising pigs, which of course was prohibited for Jews to have anything to do with pigs. And so he's at the lowest of the low. He's literally hit the very bottom rung of life. And for those of us, again, who know what it's like to hit bottom, this was the worst possible condition. Not only was he taking care of pigs, but he couldn't even enjoy the same kind of food the pigs were enjoying. And so at some point he realizes if only he could eat the pods, the leftovers of the farm, that it's like his only option. It's the last thing he has left to do. And so finally he comes to his senses, as Jesus says, and says, back home, even the slaves, the farm hands, eat better than this. And so I know what I'll do. I'll return home and I'll beg for forgiveness and ask my father to take me on as a hired hand. I might as well work, if I'm going to work as a farm hand, I might as well work at home for my father rather than here in this far off land. He uses a term about if I go back, I can ask my father to take me on. And the term he actually used is skilled craftsman. He's thinking to himself in the story, according to Jesus, if only my father would take me on as a skilled craftsman, then I would eventually be able to earn the money back to pay back the debt I owe to my father and my older brother, and maybe at some point finally get back in the good graces of my family and my community. And so it goes, rehearsing the story to himself over and over again. I will say to my father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Please take me into your household as a hired servant. Now, the text tells us that even though many days have passed, the father still waited longingly, expectantly for the wayward son to return. And so sure enough, the day that the son is stumbling and humbling his way back home again, the father, who's keeping vigil from a high point in the land, sees this figure and finally recognizes that the son, the beloved son who was lost, is returning to him. And in yet another amazing turn in this story is that the father begins running towards the child. And any of us who've had that experience of a child running to us to be swooped up in our arms, or vice versa, us running to catch a child up in our arms, it's a wonderful, delightful feeling. But in this culture, in the Palestinian culture, once again, it was utterly shameful for a grown man to be running, because of course to run, you have to hike up the skirts of your robe and show off more than you should be showing off. And so it was considered very shameful. And yet this father, willing to overcome any embarrassment, runs to welcome the son into his arms. We know that this younger son has broken the father's heart on a very, very deep level when he said to his father, "Dad, why don't you drop dead?" And so again, we can expect that the father would have some conditions, right, in order to welcome him back home again. That he has to go through a certain process of maybe compensation or rehabilitation. I mean, he's blown it big time. But that's not what we hear in this story. We assume that he'd have to somehow square things up, yet the father simply welcomes him home, kind of sweeps aside his confession of sin, and immediately starts the celebration. It is, in fact, the theme that we hear in these three stories that Jesus told about the lost being found here in the 15th chapter of Luke. First, it was about the lost sheep. And we all have that image, I think, of the shepherd carrying the sheep on their shoulders. And when the one lost sheep returns home again, all of the flock celebrate, all of the community celebrate. Secondly, when the woman has lost the one coin, the precious coin that was probably part of her marriage dowry, she can't find it. She scours her whole house. She sweeps and sweeps and sweeps and still can't find it. And when she finally finds it, not only does she rejoice, but again, her whole neighborhood rejoices with her. And then in this third story, when the lost son, the precious son, the beloved son, returns, the father throws the celebration. Unfortunately, the older brother is not ready, willing, and able to join in that celebration. And so this may be where we could find ourselves in the story, whether as the parent, whether as the younger child, or whether as the older brother. What is God calling us to do? How is God calling us to be part of this story? Welcoming the lost, celebrating the lost is found, understanding with deep compassion the brokenheartedness that the father must have felt, and especially joining in the celebration that the lost has been found and has been returned. In the story, we hear that the father's broken heart is mended by this extension of amazing grace that reaches out to welcome home the lost child. So too, we can celebrate God's amazing grace with us, that welcomes us, that restores us to right relationship with God, to one another, and with all creation. And so let us continue to hear this resounding invitation to join in the joy of the community, celebrating those who have been far away and have come home. Thanks be to God.